Okay, well, welcome everybody. Happy Yule and happy winter solstice. So my name is Rev Aryshta Dean, and I'm an entheogenic facilitator and researcher and educator. So tonight I'm excited to talk about what I believe to be the most important topic in all of human history, the mystical experience. But before I get started, I want to thank the Portland Psychedelic Society for hosting tonight's webinar and event, giving me this opportunity to be in front of you tonight. This is quite the honor. So I really believe that we're on the edge of a dramatic shift in social consciousness. And I'm honored to be here in Oregon as we all lead the way into this new psychedelic therapy model and entheogenic religious freedom that we're experiencing here in Oregon. So because we're streaming live, I do want to reiterate that I nor PPS endorse or condone any illegal use of psychotropic substances. This presentation is on the historical context, the current academic research, and the shamanic wisdom of legal medicines for therapeutic and religious use. My presentation tonight is based entirely upon peer-reviewed literature, and the endnotes for all of this will be posted on the Portland Psychedelic Society Facebook page for those of you who are interested. So all of that out of the way, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I used to be an atheist. My degree is in aerospace engineering, and I was an officer in the Air Force. Afterwards, I joined HP, Hewlett-Packard, and I was an engineer and worked my way up through Silicon Valley over 20 years. And I was an executive and finally a business consultant to many of the major players. Well, I played that game for 20 years until the dot-com crash of 2001. And then I, like many of my peers, walked away bankrupt and penniless. So at that point, then I realized that it was a time to change my life. So I moved away from Silicon Valley and a couple years later found my way up to Northern California, and through my partner, I met a group of psychotherapists and former students of Stan Grof who had formed a mystery school, and they were teaching breathwork and indigenous non-ordinary states of consciousness. From there, I jumped into the deep end and tumbled down the rabbit hole of entheogens. And I had my first mystical experience in 2005. I had really no medicine experience before then. But I found out in my own personal subjective way that there was a consciousness out there in the universe, and I made contact with it, and I was an instant convert. That experience changed my life. And from then on, I began this quest to understand what it was that I had experienced. So I took all of my scientific curiosity and I applied it to the field of this history and all the neurological research that's going on. I dove into it full time, and I was honored to be able to study with indigenous elders and shamanic practitioners from around the world. In 2010, I was ordained and traveled to Egypt to be initiated in the Temple of Isis. In 2013, I spent the summer on a sabbatical in Greece researching the historical use of entheogens at Delphi and Eleusis. And from there, I went to Thailand to study about the Blue Lotus and its psychotropic uses in the ancient religions. From all of this, I discovered that humanity has been obsessed with the mystical experience for thousands of years. And like many scholars, I believe it is the very core of all of our religious beliefs. So tonight we're going to go over our definitions of what the mystical experience actually is. I'm going to talk about the religious history over this last 5,000 years. And then we're going to talk about our current level of psychedelic therapy and what the future holds. And then I'm going to talk briefly about some of my experience about creating that mystical experience. A little definitions here. So God is everything that you can imagine. Let's talk about cosmic consciousness and divine source and the universe as a whole. We're not going to personify it in this discussion. It is whatever you imagine gods are, or non-duality. And then religion. That's not current religion. That is any organized faith or practice that has ever been. And then most specifically is entheogen. And this was coined by Carl Ruck and Gordon Watson back in 1979. And it is the concatenation of the Greek words entheos and genesis, meaning creating the divine within. And it is the consciousness altering use of any substance for religious, shamanic, or spiritual uses. Okay, it specifically is for inducing a mystical experience. So that's what an entheogen is. The mystical experience was originally written about by William James in 1902 when he wrote the book Varieties of the Religious Experience. Now, we have to understand that mystical experience, the word mystical, is a brand new 1960s word. But before then, it was always considered and associated with religious. So ineffable, which means it defines expression. It must be experienced to be understood. Words will not do it justice. It's noetic, and that is that it reveals a deep and perhaps hidden truth. It's transient, it won't last long, and there's a sense of timelessness to it, but in actuality, it's generally pretty short. And it's passive. It happens to you. It's not something that you reach out and do. It happens to you instead. And then in 1963, this last one, unity, was added by Happold, and that is oneness, non-duality. It is the moment that you are connected to the universe. What's the difference between the mystical experience and the religious experience? Well, honestly, it's only the word God, and that there was an interaction with God. A religious experience is typically that you are in direct communication to the divine. It is talking to you, you are talking to it. However, this gentleman named Sigmund Freud, back in the 30s, claimed all mystical states were psychotic. Oops. Well, all of a sudden, anybody was having direct interactions with God, it was okay to pray, but if you were hearing the words of God, you could very easily be claimed as schizophrenic. So by the time Aldous Huxley came around in 1954, he then changed it over to mystical when he was working with mescaline. And then finally, Stace, he defined it philosophically, made big presentation at MIT, and boom, it was no longer religious, it was a mystical experience. So, but does this non-duality always hold true? You know, for thousands of years, the religious experience was the opportunity to dialogue with the gods. It was part and parcel to the ancient religions, who, when you went to see the priest or priestess, quite typically in the ancient times, there's good reason to believe that they'd simply say, here, you go take this, go out to that field, and you go talk to God yourself. It wasn't the job of the priest or priestess to interpret the dialogue of God. It was a direct experience. So there are some subjective levels to this mystical experience, and you may have experienced these yourself. First phase is this oneness with the universe. I call this an objective. It is subjective, but you are in the viewer's seat. of seeing the oneness of the universe and seeing that you're connected with it all. But it's relatively not emotional. It is that first moment of your ego is being dissolved and you're going, oh, wow, check this out. But it hasn't hit you yet. And then the next phase is that the universe, that God, Goddess, suddenly sees you, recognizes you, makes an observation that you're there. This is the classical DMT machine elves idea that Terence McKenna talked about, that all of a sudden the universe saw you and there was this interaction, and suddenly there could be some terror involved in this as you go, wait a minute, who's looking at me? This is the point where all of a sudden it gets real personal, real emotional, real fast. The last phase is possession. It is this extreme physical, emotional burst of energy that's normally a fraction of a second long. It can lift you off the ground. I've seen people contort and literally lift themselves up on their shoulders and their heels completely off the ground. It's what the Christians call rapture. And the definition of that is something Webster defines that as this expression, manifestation of ecstasy or passion. It's a state of experience of being carried away and completely, overwhelmingly in an emotional state. There's no way that you're not going to burst into tears. This is cosmic orgasm. This is absolutely being taken by the divine. So for thousands of years, people have been seeking the mystical experience, and they've used every imaginable technique in the books. They've used meditation, they've used fasting, and ecstatic dance, and chanting and drumming, and extreme pain-inducing physicality, sitting out in the snow, baking in the hot sun, doing everything they could to induce this mystical experience. And of course, many, many traditions have long and involved traditions and years of study. I want to tell a little story about that. One of my favorite teachers along this path once sat in front of us and said, you can spend 20 years sitting on a mountain and you'll get it, you'll get there. And she opened her hand and there was a mushroom in her hand and she said, or you can take this. Certainly, the chemical path is a shortcut, and there is a lot to be said for not having a disciplined structure to frame the religious mystical experience. People often describe spontaneous mystical experience as being absolutely life-changing. And this is especially true for people who encounter the mystical during near-death experiences, being completely disembodied and meeting deities or seeing that tunnel of light. So the religious use of psychoactive substances has been around for absolutely thousands of years, perhaps all the way back to the Stone Age. But certainly we can find these hieroglyphics and text back to ancient Egypt. So about 3000 BC is the earliest we can trace use of entheogens. But virtually every religion on earth can find its roots in altered states of consciousness, whether it be by meditation or ecstatic dance or by entheogens. But obviously, the mystical experience has been chased down through time as one of the quintessential expressions of human existence. So the mystery cults of ancient Egypt may have included virtually all the major gods and goddesses, and there was 42 of those. But certainly we know that Isis, Osiris, Hathor, Sekhmet, and Nefertem, the god of the Blue Lotus, were certainly part of that team. but we know very little about them, and we can only rely on what the Greeks talk about by the time about 300 BC. But it's been assumed that much of the esoteric teachings of the Hermetica and those texts were descendants from the ancient texts. And of course, what Plato said, because he said he went down there and he studied. Next is the most famous of them all, and that is the Eleusinian Mysteries. And that was from about 1500 BC to about 392 AD. And the most famous. They were the pinnacle of what we believe to be the entheogenic mystical state, which went on for about 2,000 years. And the Kaikion was, of course, hypothesized by Ruck and Watson in The Road to Eleusis as being ergot, probably mixed in with some other chemicals, other substances. Currently, one of the best sellers is The Immortality Key by Brian Marescu, and he talks about how all of this transitioned into the Eucharist of the early Christians. And then finally, the ceremonial use of soma, of which we really don't know what it was, but it was used within the Hindu ceremonial uses for also about the same amount of time that the Eleusinian mysteries were going on, roughly about 1,000 years of recorded history of using soma. So I have some pictures here I'm going to talk about. On my journeys around the world, I had the opportunity to go to Egypt and actually see and understand what it was we were looking at. And there's been a lot of misrepresentation by the 19th century Egyptologists because they didn't understand what they were looking at. This first top image is from Abydos, and it shows Blue Lotus and mushrooms and poppies and probably mandrake fruit, but we're not quite sure. The bottom image is from the Temple of Horus at Edfu, and that is about a 6-foot long panel, a relief, and it shows blue lotus flowers draped over jars. And for at least 1,000 years, this was a very common reference to Blue Lotus, and if you ask me, that is a perfect representation of what's in the jar. And this is from Dendera, Temple of Hathor. The circled image there shows a jar with mushrooms sprouting from it. There's also mushrooms up in the right-hand upper corner of that offering. There are many references to mushrooms and Blue Lotus as offerings to the gods, as obviously sacrament. And the Eleusinian Mysteries. Even though it is said that, gosh, we don't know what they were using as a sacrament, it's right there. There is shafts of either wheat or rye in the top image and poppies. This is very important because we have to remember that the Eleusinian Mysteries had 3,000 to 4,000 people packed into a temple in the stadium seating. And these people were in there for a ceremony that lasted virtually all night. If you've ever been in a group ceremony, ayahuasca or any other group setting, you'll know that 4,000 people are going to have to be pretty darn calm. So poppy could be a very key part of that formula. In the bottom register, you see there is the sharing of what has been said to be mushrooms between Demeter and Persephone, but just as well, they could be poppies. Either way, they're entheogenic, and that's certainly part of the entire equation at Eleusis. Is psychedelic therapy the red pill? Of course, this is the reference to the Matrix, and more specifically about waking up from the illusion of what we think is reality, and that stark realization that the world is a much different place than you really thought it was, which is really the focus of the mystical experience. And go back. Go back. Thank you. So, we're now rediscovering the psychological benefits of these ancient plants and medicines. Like I said, but what happens when a patient or a participant wakes up from this therapy? Does their life completely change? So this is a bit of an oversimplification, I will admit. However, we have a twofold idea about psilocybin therapy that is being in the process of legalized, and we're going to go live here in Oregon in January of next year. So not 22, but in 2023, we have to have an entire program built to enable psychedelic therapy, psilocybin therapy. So there are many physiological effects to psilocin, which is psilocybin breaks down to psilocin, and it binds with our serotonin receptors in our brain, which can last months, as they can produce a natural antidepressant and balancing of serotonin. And this is what the pharmaceutical companies are chomping at the bit about, with billions of dollars worth of investments heading towards this, to be able to replace our other antidepressants and be able to use psilocybin to be able to just medically and physiologically take the place of our old antidepressants. However, there is a great deal of debate going on right now, and there are literally dozens of peer-reviewed papers talking about that the mystical experience is what resets the brain, is that ego dissolving oneness with the universe that changes your perspective about yourself and reality. Most important is that every single research paper I've seen in the last 10 years says that the best odds of a participant hitting that peak experience, that mystical experience, have been about 60%. 60% odds that you're going to you're going to ring the bell of a mystical experience. But is that good enough? With those kind of odds, a person, a patient in this case, could have repeated sessions and still never get a mystical experience. 2,000 years ago, the Eleusinian priesthood got 3,000 to 4,000 people into this temple and evidently hit a home run with almost all of them. They kept it secret. There wasn't, certainly if there had been a lot of people going, oh, that didn't work. Oh, that's bunk. No, they all came out of it and said, oh my gosh, it was the greatest thing that I ever experienced. They must have had a secret. That secret is set and setting. So back in the 60s, Timothy Leary published and he's given the credit for calling it set and setting. I'm going to get to that in just a minute. But the other requirement of inducing providing a mystical experience is it takes time. This thing can take 4 to 6 hours, as you all probably know. Music is highly recommended. It's even by peer-reviewed papers. And obviously it's most effective at night. So this is probably not something that's going to happen in some psychotherapist office. We're going to have to come up with a different kind of model. Here are some of the, I want to say, I have it written as risks, but let's just talk about some interesting side effects here. First and foremost, the participant may have a religious experience. So let me just say for me, before my first mystical experience, I was an atheist. I didn't believe in God. After my mystical experience, I believed that there was something out there. The psychotherapeutic use of psilocybin can then produce a religious experience. And yet we still have a great deal of therapists out there that are still modeling after Sigmund Freud, not necessarily Jung, and may look at this as saying, oh, the person's got some pathologies here about that they're hearing the voice of God. The experience itself, the mystical experience itself, can be so earth-shattering that it can create a spiritual emergency. It's spiritual emergence, as Stan Grof talks about. So if we're then putting the person into this state and then all of a sudden they go into a spiritual emergency, are we then compounding the issues that a patient is currently being treated for? Certainly, we're going to work all that to the surface, but this needs to be taken into consideration. It can and will change one's personal life. I have personally witnessed hundreds of people who have changed to their career, gotten divorces, their life got turned upside down because they had a mystical experience or because they were chasing this down the rabbit hole. And then finally, the shamanic aspect of this, our elders will talk about that the experience itself may cause psychic phenomenon. If our therapists aren't prepared for things flying off the walls, they're going to be kind of surprised because this stuff does happen. Okay, here we're going to talk about set and setting. So set is defined as one's at the participant's mental attitude and preparation. The Oregon Psilocybin Services Group has already started figuring this out, that the therapeutic aspect is going to take several sessions of preparation to get the participant ready mentally to go into this. So the big thing here is the intention, is setting that intention of what is going to be dealt with or thought about or laid down or said in prayer. Setting. This is all about my world. This is the physical and environmental aspects of it. So this is, setting up the theme of being able to have what I call a focus table. In the religious aspect, that's called an altar. It can be anything. You want to be able to allow the participant to bring in anything that they believe is religious or a statue of something, to be able to then trigger this mystical experience. We're looking for something in a cohesive environment that makes them feel like, ooh, this is interesting and mystical. The candles on all four corners, doing it at night, the music that is played, all of these things are key to being able to stimulate the person into this state that we're after, that we're inviting that experience to happen. Instead of making it all sterile, let's go ahead and make it invocative. So Timothy Leary said, hey, this is the biggest chunk of inducing the mystical experience. And we've got papers that are being published as, they're coming out right now talking about the placebo effect of all this, is that, we had a blind test and randomized, and when some people had psilocybin and some didn't, and yet some people still had a mystical experience. Yeah, if you put them into that setting, example of the great cathedrals of Europe, designed to just induce awe. You walk in and go, oh, that was the objective. So also going into this of understanding that the placebo effect is the set and setting. That's the reason that we are able to have spontaneous, non-drug induced mystical experiences and have for thousands of years. It's way more complicated than just medicine. Again, making it a mystical setting. There's an aspect of the human consciousness that has context to what is sacred. Like I said, whether it be a church setting or symbology or artifacts or iconery, but certainly simple candles in the dark, ooh, that sets the theme right away. Music. Music is not something from a random playlist. it needs to be staged. Every single moment of the person's journey is reaching a peak, and then it comes down on the backside very slowly. And so your music is a big part of how that plays out, because you want to take them to that peak, and the music that is being played has to be conducive to that. And we have peer-reviewed papers that are talking about that, yeah, boy, music is a really big deal. This needs to be trained. So training needs to be a big, big part of our psychedelic therapy. And finally, the experience is personal. You know, I see this references of the therapeutic use, and you know, the therapists are huddled around the person, holding their hand the entire time. Maybe, but in my training is you sit back, you hold your space, you sit on the pillow, and you give them the opportunity to have their experience, and you're not involved. You have to sit back. Now, certainly if they need you, yeah, that's what your job is, that you're supposed to be there. But essentially you give them their space to have this very personal experience. All in all, we're trying to provide an opportunity for them to have the greatest experience of their life. We're kind of making a stage, you know? Like I said, with focal point, whether you call it an altar or a table or what have you, they can have pictures of their elders. I mean, you know, you can have anything on there that you want, but if you have a focal point where the person that is the participant is like, maybe they can focus on those objects, you know, perhaps that they bring in, or that you're working with them to be able to create this sacred environment. And I talk about building on the participant's own spirituality, not taking mine or us as a group as sitters. We don't want to force them into, it's not my religion I'm putting on there, but we certainly invite them if they have something. Hey, let's include that. Let's let them feel as comfortable and as involved as possible in this. Like I said, we're feeding this mysterious nature of the whole scenario, creating this environment. What is this all going to do to society? My point as a historian is that this is the first time in 1600 years that society has legally and philosophically embraced the use of entheogens. We're on the verge. We've got cities, states all across the country that are decriminalizing medicines. And in fact, we are on the verge of then legalizing. California's the next one up on the bill for legalizing entheogens. So the sociological state of the world is in the process of changing. Let me back up here. Buddha was born about, 650 BC? And then we had Plato and Socrates and Aristotle in the 400s. But in between that 250 years, we had every single Oriental philosopher, Sun Tzu, Lao Tzu, I can't even think of all the list, but if you look them up, you're going to find out that there is this time frame in history where the philosophy of the world changed radically. There was this incredible enlightenment period that the world went through. And we can actually look back and trace this to the social use of entheogens. Specifically, all of our Greek philosophers, all were initiates to the Eleusinian mysteries. And certainly Soma was a big piece of the Hindu culture and quite possibly into Buddha as well. So my point about this is that culturally, society has not seen legal entheogens on a social level, on a fully accepted, fully endorsed level since the fall of Rome. This very well may change society, stripping away our old beliefs. and resulting changes in our society may be drastic. You know, when Christianity took over and made all of the entheogens illegal eventually, we don't know about how long, but certainly by about 1000 AD, it was pretty much shut down. Certainly our society changed. Now reversing that and opening it back up to the world of people having mystical experiences in general across the society is going to change things. And that is what we talk about, waking up. And waking up may alienate you from society. Does that sound familiar? So here's a picture from the Matrix. So this is the point when Neo wakes up in the power plant and he realizes he has been asleep in this chamber his entire life. And all of a sudden he sees that everyone he knows, everyone he has ever known is still asleep. And you can't wake them up. They have to have the experience themselves. You can't go knock on that chamber over there and try to wake them up. You can't. So like I said, this first time in 1600 years, using entheogens in psychotherapy, legalizing it at that level, is then going to promote the legalization on a whole, because it's going to be pretty tough to keep that separated. The legalization is going to bleed out into the political arena. And of course, then legalization then leads to new spiritual worldviews. You know, if we're having personal relationships with however we view God, goddess, the universe, what happens to our old religious views? Those new worldviews could then lead to a brand new society. And then the separation of those who have the experience and those who haven't had the experience may cause conflict. Right now, billions of dollars are on the table to be invested. We've got roughly 10 billion, I just saw, that's expected to be invested in the next 5 years. That much money being invested cannot be stopped, regardless of who's in power, who's politics. Doesn't matter who's president, doesn't matter who's in Congress, can't reverse this once that much money is on the table. Society is on the verge of a massive change because of this. And my friends, you are that change. Thank you very much. I think we'll open it up to questions now.
I know music is a fantastically important part of it, and if there were guidelines in terms of finding music, and I've been reading a lot lately about the fact that different stages of the experience benefit from special music, and I know the speaker alluded to that.
Real simple answer is that Johns Hopkins actually has their playlists made public. If you like classical music, I love my playlist. I've worked so hard for the last 10 years assembling some of the most awesome music. Everybody that works with me just flabbergasted at this. But you know, it's personal. It's something that both you as a facilitator and the participant. So I was talking about being in sync with the person's spirituality. Let's say we have somebody that's Hindu. They certainly would appreciate some wonderful music in that venue. Somebody that's into trance is really going to appreciate the modern electronic aspects. So understanding who you are sitting for and their needs is a big part of this. And I don't know if, having something that's just canned and you're going to use it every single time. I've been in that environment and I didn't like it. That's why I said, no, we're not going to do it. I'm going to make my own. And
yeah, I know my comment, which I make every time the topic of music comes up. I am not at all a fan of the Johns Hopkins list. And yet I know people that love it. And so it is extremely personal. And I would just say for anybody, making your own list ahead of time so you're not having to navigate it during
Oh,
your
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, I've seen some stuff written about the idea of being DJ live. If I'm and I've tried that. If I'm playing DJ, I'm not focused on the person that I'm taking care of. I'm so busy with the technicalities here, and it's like, no, I have a playlist. I may change it. I may skip a song. You know, person may look at me and go, oh, yeah. So music is personal. Make a playlist, but at the same time, don't be afraid to work around.
I have a question about music and the mystical experience in terms of just some general guidelines. Like, do you recommend like something from somebody's past, or is it better to have things that have lyrics versus no lyrics?
It's pretty much a general consensus that lyrics don't work. There are exceptions, but just having instrumentals seems to be the way to go. Music from again, you're going to need to know the person. Let's talk about in a therapeutic setting where you may want to use that piece of music to trigger them. If all of a sudden it was like, oh, that was my wedding song, or that was my favorite song, and in high school, obviously that music is then going to bam bring up all those memories. Is that what you want, or is that not what you want? So
I did some experimentation with asking people to bring their own playlist after discarding Johns Hopkins, many people not responding to it, trying some others. There was research at Johns Hopkins by a young professor who had a career in professional music before he joined the faculty at Johns Hopkins, and he studied the effects of music on people and was now studying the effects of psychedelics on people. And he combined the two studies. And what he found was that the response from a personal playlist was greater than what he could get from other playlists. I've lost the fellow's name, so I can't give you that reference. But I just wanted to say that as a follow-up to the music. And then I wanted to ask you a question. I belong to a psychedelic church in Oakland, although I live in Seattle. It's called the Sacred Garden Community, and we plan on opening a church here in Seattle using totally what Oakland has developed. What is your sense of how quickly in this somewhat changed environment we may see the rise and acceptance of psychedelic churches? And I mean by acceptance, I mean under the Religious Freedom Act and such things.
That's a tough question. That's like trying to say who's going to be our president in 2024. There can be a big wrench in this, huge resistance, or the floodgates just completely get opened. My personal feeling is that once we have psilocybin therapy going on, and that is successful, and we're proving to the world that the stuff works, then it's going to be more socially accepted. Our entheogenic churches right now are still considered fringe. They're still way out there. And whether or not the legal standing of being able to be protected as a church, again, we're talking about what the social acceptance is. How is this going to work its way out? And I have no idea. I wish I had a crystal ball and I could tell you, but again, money talks, and we've got billions on the table, so something's got to give.
I have always believed that psychedelics, and my word, entheogens, or not my word, but the word that I use more commonly, or sacraments, because I do see this in the religious context, that it would not succeed until the psychedelics had entered public consciousness through the portal of medicine. I think that's going to be our biggest gain, And right now, there's a suit
I
that was
agree.
started in Seattle regarding the use of psilocybin in end-of-life patients. So a local doctor is suing the DEA, Ames Institute versus DEA. And that case was heard in the Ninth Circuit in September. And I won't say it's bulletproof, but I think the DEA is going to lose that case. And that might help, because that
Yeah.
will, if the Right to Try Act is found to be valid and opening up psilocybin to end-of-life patients, I think that's going to make a tremendous difference for us who are interested in the mystical and the religious aspects of it. So
I agree.
I'll mute now, but thank you for what
Yeah.
you're doing right now.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much. If you guys are interested in some of my research and some of my other presentations, I have a YouTube channel. You can look me up. I'm the only Aryshta in the world, Aryshta. You can find me on YouTube. And my presentation to Exploring Psychedelics, and was it all the way back in 2017, 2016, was on the Blue Lotus. And I specifically talk about how that entheogen was used by the Greeks or the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans.
Hey, yeah. So I just wanted to ask your thoughts about sensory deprivation during a mystical experience. When I did have that experience in a therapeutic setting, and so I had an eye mask on the entire time, and I did not move because I was so scared of getting out of that world and not being able to get back to it. But I would like to have that experience where I'm not like, just completely horizontal without being able to look at nature or anything. So I just wanted to see your opinion on that.
I actually had it on my slide and took it off. Very common to be able to use an eye mask for ceremony. And yeah, that's then another aspect about doing it at night. You close it all down to just what's inside the circle and the candles lit, and there isn't anything on the outside. That's that shrinking down the sensory aspects of it.
I'd like to also say separate sensory deprivation in and of itself, whether it's a dry or wet environment, i.e. Sensory deprivation tank or a sensory deprivation cocoon, is a non-ordinary state of consciousness after a certain period of time in and of itself. It will
Absolutely.
move you into different spaces, and you can easily reach spaces, psychedelic spaces. I know I have in those situations. So to the previous speaker, you don't have to worry about not being able to get back to it. You can you can take your shades off and you can move around and absolutely get out in nature. There's no better place to be when you're experiencing a non-ordinary state of consciousness than to be out in nature. Connecting with nature and it connecting with you are really important. Oh, and sensory deprivation along with psychedelics take it to a whole nother level. So
I am waiting to tank. I want to do a tank float with entheogens. That's on my list. Somebody asked, I saw a comment about my book. I am in the process of writing a book called The Priestess of the Blue Lotus. It is not finished yet, so I don't have a date. That is a work in progress. It's basically about all of this, how that relates to our future. Yeah. So it is coming. I am excited about the idea of being able to teach facilitator training for entheogenic use. I am in the process of creating that curriculum and be able to get that started here next year to be able to be teaching facilitation.
I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about timing, especially because today's the solstice. Like, is there any significance in, selecting a time that would be more effective?
Good question. Oh yeah, I love it. It's a really good question, Bridget. Yeah, I love doing ceremonies on full moons and new moons. Again, there's, whether it's biological aspects involved or just the million years worth of evolution, it's like doing it at night. Certainly, like John said about going out in nature during the daytime. Yes, that's a nice experience. But there's also this mysterious aspect of the nighttime and the full moon. And, I've had some, I've done I facilitated a ceremony on Mount Shasta, full moon. Oh, it was outdoors. Everything was on battery power for the music, and it was extraordinary. We definitely rang the bells that night. Yeah. I have astrologer friends. I tell them about, we're going to do a ceremony on such a date, and they'll go, oh no, that's a bad date. Why don't you move it to that date? I'm all for it. Timing, yeah, anything and everything that we can do to help the spirits along. I'm all for.
Nature still exists at night. I wasn't discounting that at all.
I know. But it is entirely different experience. Yeah, I've had some great experiences out in the forest. I'm gonna go on a limb here and talk about solo work versus having a sitter. The old idea of Terence McKenna talking about 5 grams in total darkness and you're alone. That certainly is, no music, no nothing, you're just laying there. Okay. But there's also something about if I've got somebody sitting for me that's taking care of all my needs, need water, need that blanket, whatever I need, their job is to take care of me. And so, but if I'm trying to do all this by myself, if I'm solo in a ceremony, I'm trying to do this myself, I got part of my brain that's holding space and part of my brain that's trying to let go. That's a tough, and it's like, oh, what about that music? And I didn't like that piece of music, and I'm going to fast forward and I'm trying to set up and do it. I am all about having a facilitator, having a guide, having, friend or professional that's sitting on that pillow, and that is their job. Of course, that's the way I was trained too. And I haven't, if you talk about dropping acid at a rock concert, I have never had that experience. I don't know what that's like. My experience has always been entheogenic, ceremonial use, religious use. That's my world. So admittedly, I don't have that kind of experience. But again, having a sitter is way better.
I didn't catch who asked it, but somebody asked that you speak specifically about Blue Lotus before you leave.
Blue Lotus is what's called an allostatic modulator. It itself is not entheogenic, but when used with psilocybin specifically, the Blue Lotus has a chemical called porphine, which binds with the DNA in between the DNA strands. It twists and elongates the 5-HT2A neuroreceptor that is responsible for our psychedelic experiences. And from my research and my study and my practical research and using this, it amps up the possibility of a mystical experience. So if we say that psilocybin by itself is about 60% chance of being able to ring the bell, with Blue Lotus, it is much, much higher. And the other interesting thing about this allostatic modulator idea is that most of the people that have experienced this ceremony talk about that the level of visuals that you normally get with psilocybin kind of go away. And instead of getting all the lights and the geometry and everything in behind your eyes, you get this emotional experience of oneness, mystical experience. And I believe that's exactly what this was all about right back here. So yes, take a look at my YouTube video on the Blue Lotus. It talks about the history and misconceptions.
I will talk about briefly what's coming up on Imbolc, which is February 1st. I will be doing a presentation on psychedelics, ceremony, and sacred space. How do you create your own ceremony? How do you create your own sacred space? What does that mean? It will take it in terms of the preparation, the set, the setting, the actual journey itself, and the integration afterwards. We'll talk about that in the context of a neo-pagan or pagan worldview, which is where I come from. Those of you who are witches or pagans, you may not learn a lot. Those of you who are not, but who are curious about how do I create my own ceremony, this is going to be a kind of how to do it
Perfect.
session. So I welcome all of you to join me on the 1st in bulk, 1st of February. We'll see you then.
Early next month. I promise I will get that up very soon. The 8th, there's a New and Curious in person here in Portland, followed by a addiction recovery group in person downtown in Chinatown. And then later in the month, the 23rd, we're doing it in person and lots of other things on the calendar. So give that a look.